It is 10:02. Great. All right, we're going to get started. Welcome, everybody. My name is Aisha Brooks Lytle, serving as your executive presbyter. Thanks to the staff who are on this call. We are so excited. Our own Zeena Regis is presenting today. I will ask as we get started that if you could mute yourselves, that would be wonderful. And then at the appropriate time, when it's time for everybody to chat, then you will be asked to unmute. Excellent. So again, I'm thankful that Zeena is here with us. Zeena is an elder at Oakhurst Presbyterian Church. She is a hospice chaplain, consultant for spirituality, grief, and end-of-life issues, and does so many amazing things. She did a virtual workshop with PW, as we were talking about earlier, and is going to lead us and guide us in this conversation. So Zeena, thank you for being with us, and I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you. I am so happy to be here. I'll tell you a little bit more about myself, just so you know who is talking to you all this long time. But it is my prayer that this will be a conversation. So I want to hear from you all throughout our time together. But like Aisha said, I am a elder at Oakhurst Presbyterian. I've been a member at Oakhurst maybe since 2004, 2005. I always say I am so grateful that I spent my 20s in that community. Now my 20s, 30s, now I'm 40. But to have that community at that time when I was redefining community. I went to Agnes Scott College, is where I graduated. And I moved into a little attic apartment in Oakhurst. And was walking down the street and said, this church looks interesting. And I'm not Presbyterian. I'm a military brat. I grew up on in a base chapel. A base chapel. Like there was a Protestant service and a Catholic service. And so I spent people would ask me when I came to Agnes Scott, what's your denomination? And I would say Protestant, and people would be like, what? I don't even know. Why are you saying that? But that's all I knew, because it was the Protestant service and the Catholic service. We went to the Protestant service. So I just saw this church and went and said I was gonna go to Oakhurst Baptist, go to all the little churches around, and never made it anywhere outside of Oakhurst. And I'm just outside of Oakhurst Pres, and I'm so grateful because Oakhurst Pres has shepherded me through everything, through my seminary, through marriage, through children, through my own grief, through everything. Oakhurst has been there, so I'm grateful for that. I graduated from Columbia Seminary in 2012, and I started immediately a residency as a hospice chaplain. And it was really just one of those things, it was totally a God thing. I had no interest in being a hospice chaplain, actually. I did my first internship as a prison chaplain, and I loved it. But at the time, the correctional department here in Georgia was phasing out a lot of paid chaplain positions. And my supervisor at the time said, I just really see you in hospice. You have that would just be, it seems like that would be in line with your gifts. And I was like, this is either going to go really poorly or it's going to go really well, because I was like, I just don't see myself there, but I will take the leap. And I did. And so I've been working in hospice as either a chaplain or bereavement coordinator since 2012. And then grief work took on a really, really personal dimension in my life. My sister-in-law died unexpectedly, very young, and we are raising her son. And so I had been doing all this work. And interestingly, this is how God works. I was actually working as a pediatric hospice chaplain and doing all this work in pediatric grief care for the siblings. And then right in that time that I'm doing all of that work, my sister-in-law dies, and we are raising a grieving adolescent. He's now 18 and he's a senior in high school, and he is just an amazing kid downstairs doing virtual learning. And so I am grateful for what he continues to teach me about grief care, and about just being in touch with my own grief. Um, yeah, he teaches me a lot about that all of the time, and that our grief changes. And so, and I'll tell this story. I didn't know if I was going to tell the story or not, but I will tell it. So, at the same time he came to live with us, I was dealing with a diagnosis of infertility, that came in a really dramatic way. Like my lung was collapsed. Come to find out, I had endometriosis in my chest and all this stuff. So I was in the hospital, for like 18 days trying to figure it all out, and just feeling like I had always known that I was going to have children. And I'm like, I'm going to have a house full of kids. Like at my wedding at Oakhurst Pres, I already had my children named. So people brought monogram things with my with my child's names on them, because I knew them so much, that people knew them at church. And then when that came, I was like, I don't know what to do with that. And I didn't know, even though I was working in hospice, I didn't know to call it grief. And I remember talking to Nashawn, that's my nephew, and one day he was like, God is really mean to you right now. And just have it. And he just kind of, the way he kind of said it, like, I don't know, it was really helpful for me to get in touch with my grief, because I did feel in some ways like this is really mean. And just him naming it, I think allowed me to begin to heal through that process, and not even having these easy answers. Like it was never going to be okay for me to say, you needed a mother because your mother died and I can't have babies. And here we are as this happy family. It was like, we have both experienced loss, and we are living together, and we are loving each other and parenting, but we also need to recognize that these losses are a part of that journey. And so having him as my kid has been really helpful. And he's about to graduate from high school, which is amazing. But he reminds me his mom won't be there. And so that he shows me that each phase of life, we are still carrying that grief, and that our future plans, our grief is still there. So a lot of what we'll be doing today is just getting in touch and being able to name and notice and honor the grief today in our life that we carry. So I'm going to share my screen. Of course, I just practiced this, but you know how I do every time. I'm like, am I sharing it right? Is it right? Okay. So let's see. And then, of course, I'm sharing the completely wrong thing. All right, let's get this presented together. And I just want to tell you, as we're sharing, these are for me to keep me on track. So they may be all out of order or whatever, because I was just moving some things around. But just so you know, if you're like, what is this about? These are just to keep me on track. So today we're just going to talk about learning to grieve well. That's going to be our first talk, our first kind of thing that we're going to talk about. And that'll actually take most of the time. And then we want to talk about modeling good grief. How do we model grief for others? And then supporting others on their grief journey. It's just kind of a tack on the end, because I think so much of how we can support others is about how we learn to grieve well and how we model good grief. And the supporting others comes when we learn those things, I believe. So I wanted to start with a poem. This is, and I thought I changed that, Denise. It's not Dennis, it's Denise Levertov. And so I'll just read it. Grief. I should not treat you like a homeless dog who comes to the back door for a crust or a meatless bone. I should trust you. I should coax you into the house and give you your own corner, a worn mat to lie on, your own water dish. You think I don't know you've been living under my porch. You long for your real place to be readied before winter comes. You need your name, your collar, and tag. You need the right to warn off intruders, to consider my house your own, and me your person, and yourself my own dog. And I just love that poem. And so today we will be spending some time naming our dog, putting our collar and our tag on our dog, and giving them the corner in our house, because I think that's so important in this time. So a book I'm going to refer a lot to is Healing Through Dark Emotions. It's Miriam Greenspan. It's so much. Everybody needs to buy this book. This was actually left to me when I started my first hospice job. The chaplain before me left this on my desk. And it is such a powerful book, Healing Through Dark Emotions. And I just want to, and I didn't even want to, what's the word? Like, I just wanted to give you her words. This is just from the first chapter. And I thought, whenever I revisit this book, it's like, oh my goodness, yes. It's always like, this is so timely. This is so timely. I've been saying that for 10 years, and now it feels especially timely. But she says, the inability to bear the core triad of grief, fear, and despair is the source of much of our individual and collective emotional ills. Suppressed grief often turns into depression, anxiety, or addiction. Benumbed fear can easily lead to irrational prejudice, toxic rage, and acts of violence. Overwhelming or unconscious despair often leads to severe psychic numbing or expresses itself through destructive acts to oneself and others. There are no negative emotions, just unskillful ways of coping with emotions we can't bear. I mean, I always feel like I just need to pack up and go home. Like Miriam has said it all. But I just love this idea. Her whole book is about, we need these emotions and they're not bad. We just don't know how to handle them. And I see in many ways our culture even moving more towards like, I know there's been a lot of talk about toxic positivity, but this whole idea like good vibes only, you just pray it away. Our faith will get us through it. And while I think so much of that is true, we just don't teach how to cope with these difficult emotions. And so it leads to these things of depression, anxiety, addiction, fear, and fear leading to irrational prejudice, toxic rage, acts of violence. Like, I feel like we're reading the news, in our lives when I see that. Despair, psychic numbing, expressing through destructive acts to oneself and others. I think there's just so much about how we suppress grief and how we have these maladaptive ways of dealing with our grief, because we're never in places where we are taught how to grieve. It's just something that we don't want to talk about. One, we don't want to talk about our own grief. And two, like, it's very, very difficult to teach anyone how to grieve. But one of the things I argue is that that's the only way to move forward, is to grieve, is not to go, the cliche, you can't go around it, you can't go over it, you can't go under it, you just have to go through it. And at one of the hospices I work for, I lead a grief support group. And one particular, and it's like 8 weeks long, but the latest one that I did, almost everyone in that group, the death that they were coming to process, the grief that they were coming to process, was the result of a death that was longer than 6 years ago. And it was just a powerful reminder that time does not heal all wounds. Like it's what we do with that time, and how do we get the tools to process these losses. And so part of it is we want to grieve as close to real time as possible, so many of my clients that I work with say, I just didn't give myself any space to grieve for years. And now I'm at this point in my life, I'm hitting this milestone and I'm shutting down because I just didn't give myself any space to grieve. So, don't rush to resurrection. So, I'm sure as many of you know, when you're doing a chaplaincy internship or residency, when you're doing CPE, you have to do what's called a verbatim. And that's where you write up your script of what you said in a chaplain visit. And I did that. And I was so proud of myself. I thought I had handled it so well. I was like, oh my goodness, I'm gonna get an A+ on this because I said all the right things. And I remember just in the margin, my supervisor, her name was Brenda Perry Wallace. Brenda said, she wrote, "Don't rush to resurrection." And that has become a mantra of my ministry and my practice. And it feels so fitting right now in this Lenten journey. It feels so fitting in the pandemic that we're in how we're dealing with everything. It just feels like that is the message. And so what she was saying is that I had spent so much of the time trying to make people feel better that I missed Holy Saturday. And so I say all the time, like, to get from the tragedy of Good Friday to the triumph of Easter Sunday, we have to sit in Holy Saturday. And that is always very, very uncomfortable. That was uncomfortable for me. And so I was always trying to give somebody to make people feel better. And as a chaplain, I quickly learned that's not my job. I cannot make anybody feel better. I can help people feel heard. And so that is what I do. And so this rushing to resurrection, but I feel like we do it to ourselves. We rush to resurrection. We rush to bright side. I lead a Bible study at Hillside Presbyterian, and one of my favorite it's like my favorite time of the week. It's a midweek Bible study in the day. But one of the women there said her daughter accused her of bright siding everything. And she said, "Mom, I just don't need that right now." And I loved that. Bright siding, making it a verb was just like, I loved hearing that language. But we were talking about how that's exactly rushing to resurrection. Well, this is look on the bright side, or at least. And so I have just come to say that if it begins with at least or look on the bright side, we don't need to say it to anyone grieving, including ourselves. And I find that I am worse with myself. I say things to myself about my own grief that I would not say to anyone else. And so part of this not rushing to resurrection is giving ourselves permission to grieve in real time in our way, because our grief journeys are amazingly unique. No two people are going to grieve in the exact same way. And one of my dreams, I really want to do a study of how a family grief styles, because I see that so much in so many of my support groups and with my one-on-one clients, is that people are really, really annoyed by how differently they grieve from people that they love. And it can be all grieving for the same person. And they're like, who is this person? They're grieving so differently than I am. And so I think I think that's one of the things in learning to grieve well, is learning to grieve in a way that makes sense to us and that is unique to us. So that's the thing that even makes even trickier to talk about learning to grieve well, is because we all grieve so differently. We all need completely different things when we grieve. There really is no one size fits all. But part of what we are called to do, I think, in our own grief is giving ourselves permission to grieve in real time in a way that is meaningful and authentic to us. But that takes a lot of work. So, I love me some Wendy Williams. Like, please don't judge me. Actually, I know my husband. I was just yes. Please don't tell my husband that I put Wendy Williams in my presentation, because anytime if he comes in the house and she's on the TV, he's just like, how can you watch it? So if you don't know Wendy, Wendy is a talk show host, a very popular gossip person, but her catchphrase is, how you doing? And so I ask you, how you doing? One other quick story about Wendy Williams. My first day as a chaplain, I the first day that I was like by myself, I had read all these books about like final gifts, what dying people need. And so the first room that I go into to sit with, the first person who's like conscious and wants to have a conversation, Wendy Williams is on the TV. And so anyway, I walk in there and he's ready to talk. And I'm like, oh my goodness, I have studied up, I am ready. And he's like, can I ask you a question? And I'm thinking it's going to be about death, dying, grief. And I'm like, I have all the answers. And he looks at the TV and he's like, how much work do you think Wendy Williams has had done? And it was just like, it's funny. So it just is a reminder, you meet people where they are. And so we had a very lovely conversation about what we thought about Wendy Williams and the work she had done. But I say all that to say, there's so much. How you doing is how we gotta talk about grief care. We have to, in order to, wrong thing, sorry. In order to live well, and in order to grieve well, we have to live well. It is really hard to grieve well when we don't have the structures that support our grief. And part of that, and what makes it so hard, is it's almost impossible to create those structures when we're grieving. So it's so important to have those practices, those structures, those supports that support our grief before a grief event. Not saying that we can't do it while we're grieving, because sometimes it's absolutely necessary. And that is the part of the work that I feel called to do, is helping people put those structures in place when they're grieving. But it's just hard work. And so part of I feel like our call is to really always to borrow some like 12-step quips, but like that we are in spiritually fit condition before these things happen, because they will, and they do. And so part of it is building these things and living well in times when we're not grieving. And I think we're always grieving in some way. Especially right now, I think we're all grieving. And I think we've all been grieving for a longer part of the year, well over a year. But I'm talking specifically about personal losses that just feel, I think that's when it's important that we have already built some of these structures. So we're going to spend some time talking about those structures, about how you're doing. So we'll have some time to really assess, what do we have in place? And one of the things I'll add, as a chaplain, it's a Medicaid requirement. So many things that we do are Medicaid requirements, but one of them is doing this pre-bereavement assessment. So it's like a family comes on hospice. Their loved one we don't know how much time, but it's a pre-bereavement, like an anticipatory grief kind of inventory. Like, how do you think this family will do after their loved one dies? This is not an exact science at all. I always feel like, how do you gauge that? But I have found over the years that there are some things that really help me to make an educated guess about how people are going to do. And it's part of this, like, what are these structures that are in place prior to the loss? And so that is where a lot of these ideas come from, is thinking about, what are these things? what are the things that people have in place? And this is just seeing people kind of through their grief and resilience journeys and what they have in place kind of working for them. Not to say that they won't grieve, but that they're able to grieve well. And I think Medicaid and Medicare define it as like, how much do you think grief will interrupt their like daily functioning? Which I think there's so many things problematic to think about that, but really, who will be able to just continue to live while holding their grief versus having an acute grief crisis? And so these are some of the things that I've seen. So first is our circle of support. Who can we trust with our grief? Where can we let it all hang out? Where can we go when we're not pretending or hiding? I think that's such an important question. Such important questions for me, because people who have a robust circle of support, however you define it, tend to be able to grieve well. Just because we need support. We need support in all aspects of our life. And it's so hard. Once again, it's hard to build a robust, engaged circle of support when you're grieving, because we just don't have the energy to cultivate those relationships. So it's just important to really think about often, who can we trust with our grief? Where can we let it all hang out? Where can we go when we are not pretending or hiding? And part of that is practicing being vulnerable in other times in our life. And admitting that we need help. This is so timely for me. Just this morning, so I'm a person who does really, really well with external support. Like, I can set a goal, and usually if it's just my goal, I'm struggling. But if I tell somebody this is my goal, I'm more likely to do it. I need accountability. I just know this about myself now. And I've learned about this organization yesterday called Move Joy. I don't know if anybody's heard of it. It's brand new. It's a startup, and it is all about matching people with a buddy, with a workout buddy. And so you literally get on Zoom and say, I am going to do XYZ for 30 minutes or 15 minutes or whatever. You do it, and then you check back in on Zoom. You have a little video call. And so I was talking to the founder of this startup, and I was saying, kind of like going back on myself, like, oh, it's so hard. Like, I hate that I always need like external structure to really get things done. And she was saying, my PhD is in behavioral health. Most people need external support to get things done. And she shared that she did not grow up in the United States. I don't know where she grew up, but she said, where I grew up, it was just a given that we need community to do hard things. Like, it was just, we always knew that. And so she said, when she moved to the United States, like, this expectation that people do things by themselves and do them independently. She was like, one, if you push on that even a tiny bit, it falls apart, because most people who are successful in things have supports. And so Move Joy is all about just making that very clear that we need these supports. We need some buddies. During a lot of the pandemic, I had a meditation group. Literally, we would get on Zoom at 6:30 in silence, meditate for 30 minutes, and then like process what came up, read an inspirational reading, and then leave, And so I remember people saying, like, this is really ridiculous. Like, my friends are like, what are you doing? Why would you get on Zoom to sit in silence with all these people? Like, it works. So I say all those things because it's just so important that we have, like Kate said, we have a village. It takes a village. It really does. I always say that about myself. I have like a spiritual director, a pastor, a therapist, like a very robust circle of friends. I have an acupuncturist. I have I have everything to keep me together. And I realize the privilege of being able to have those things, but I also think wherever we are, it's important that we cultivate just a circle of support that we trust, that we let it all hang out, that we're not pretending or hiding. And that takes work. I think that's what we miss a lot of. It really, really takes work to cultivate that type of vulnerability in a space. But we need it when we grieve. We just do. I have come to believe that grief needs to be witnessed. Even if it's not always witnessed in the same way, I think to grieve well, we need people to witness that grief. And when we spend so much time pretending or hiding or faking or putting on a smile and acting like it's okay, I think that stunts that doesn't allow us to grieve in real time. Yep, I'm always going back. Okay. All right. So I wanted to also talk about our spiritual practices as part of our kind of grief support system structure. One of the things that I like to think about is assessing our spiritual habits. A book I read sometime in this year, everything blurring together, is Atomic Habits by James Clear. And I just love the way he thinks about habit formation and goal formation. And I'll just use weight loss because it's something that's easy to illustrate. But one of his biggest things in the book is that we begin in the wrong place. We begin with the goal. So most of us begin with the goal of saying, I want to lose 10, 15 pounds. He says that's the wrong place to begin. We should always begin with our habits and our identity. So instead of saying, I want to lose 10 to 15 pounds, we begin with what are the habits that will support that. So I want to work out for 15 minutes every day. I want to do meal prep every Sunday at 4:00. I want to eat less donuts. I don't know, whatever it is. Just beginning with the habits and beginning with the identity of saying, I'm a healthy eater. I'm a person who exercises every day. And then the identity becomes so important that actually supports your habits, that then you can reach your goal. And so I loved thinking about habit formation in that way, especially in terms of my spirituality. I wanted the identity of being someone who is a meditator, who does centering prayer every day. So part of that is I have to do it every day. I have to. So it's gotten to the point where I have a floor routine and a ceiling. There's this book called How to Be an Imperfectionist. And he talks about having a floor routine and a ceiling routine. Like your ceiling routine, that's when everything is on fire. I mean, like everything is, all cylinders are popping. You have enough time. You got up early enough in the morning. You're not rushing. You have your ceiling. So that's a good 30 minutes of, centering prayer. That's some devotional. That's some reading your Bible. It's all of that. But then he also says there are some days where that's not going to happen. So you have your floor routine, which is I'm going to read one scripture and do 2 minutes of centering prayer. But it keeps your habit intact of your spiritual habit. So it keeps your identity intact. I am a person who meditates. I am a person who does centering prayer. So even in those days where you need to do it for 1 minute, it reinforces your identity brain-wise. So that, I don't know, that helped me a lot. And so I think part of that is it's hard, once again, to adapt and engage spiritual practices when we're grieving. So it's so important to look at our spiritual habits and assess them at times where we feel healthier. And also, so that's part of it. And also creating grief rituals. There was a recent study, I think it was in the Harvard Sociology Review, that people who have rituals around their grief tend to do better. Oh, yes. Atomic Habits. I'll write it in the chat. But tend to do better. And like, I think the term they use, and I should have printed out, tend to do better around, have less symptoms of grief. That's actually what the language that they use, if they have grief rituals. And so they said, interestingly, these rituals were usually independent, secular, and individual, secular, personalized, and individualized. I'm missing a word. Secular. Well, let's just go with it. Secular, personal, and individual. So something that was very personal to them, something they did alone, and something that wasn't necessarily religious. And they talked about things like wearing their mother's brooch, or drinking out of their loved one's coffee cup that died. And this was particular people who had lost a loved one, drinking out of a coffee cup that their loved one had every morning. Like just these little rituals that really help them through their grief. And so I think a lot about, especially as people of faith, rituals are so important to us. And so it's creating and crafting grief rituals, I think, is part of our call, and helping people do that. And so there's another book called by Pauline Boss. I'm gonna have to give a good old bibliography at the end of this talk, but it's called Ambiguous Loss. And that's such a good book about like all these losses that we can't really put our finger on, if that makes any sense. The ones that we just, yes, I do. It's so good. But one of the things that Pauline Boss says is that we can tell, basically, and I'm very much paraphrasing, we can tell how good a culture is at grieving by the rituals we have around grief. And our culture is not good at grieving. We do not have a lot of rituals around grief beyond a funeral. And so I think about all of like the grieves that we have in our lives that there is no ritual around, and how powerful it would be to create some ritual, even if they are not collective, even if they're individual, personal, secular, they can be religious, however, but just some ritual that marks this loss. I think about, I just posted something, I just spoke on a panel about infertility and grief, and I put it on my Facebook, and I had so many of my friends, people who I know have known through seminary or college, or, you know, just in different places, post or send me messages like, I've had 3 or 4 miscarriages, or I'm dealing with infertility too, and all of these things, but we don't talk about it, and we don't have rituals to mark those losses. I think about breakups, like even divorce, there's no real good ritual to mark a divorce. Pet loss, there's not a lot of ritual around it. Like, we're creating more, but one of the things that it's just been on my brain since I read that study, we grieve better when we have rituals. So even just thinking about crafting rituals that mark our own personal losses, job losses, like whatever it is, anything that we're feeling grief over, it makes a lot of sense to have a little bit of ritual around it, to just mark it. And so that has been really, really important. Yes, Patricia, I love that point, that gathering at the home is a ritual that the pandemic made impossible. I'm so glad that you brought that up, because I think a lot about how we are missing so many rituals because of the pandemic. And so even the little rituals we've had, I've already said we're not great at ritual when it comes to grief, but even the rituals we haven't been able to do in the pandemic. I just lost a friend from COVID-19, literally someone there were swaths of my life where I talked to Sandra every single day. And she died of COVID last Saturday at Grady Hospital. And we are not going to be able to gather in the same way. And so a friend just called me yesterday to say, we've got to do something. We have to have a service. And her family is having a small service. But she's like, we can't let this, there are so many people whose lives she touched. So we're planning a Zoom service. But yes, like we need ritual, and when we don't have it, so I've been wondering a lot about how we're going to go forward and mourn these losses. It's just, it's too much. Jody, I love that. I love the idea of the project of creating a ritual for sending kids off to college, letting them go and wishing them well. I absolutely love that. That's my mom, this was years later after I think maybe after I graduated from college, but she said there was a lot of grief around her empty nest. And she said, I didn't know how to talk about it because my kids were doing well, but y'all were away. And I struggled with like that grief of you not being in the house. So I think that's something that we don't often talk about, and we don't have ritual around. So I love the ritual around that. Gregory, and I'm sending you so much love. I'm so sorry. But it sounds beautiful to go into his favorite restaurants on his birthday and death anniversary to keep his memory alive. I love that. One of my clients just said I love this so much. And it was just the 14th. So just 2 days ago on Pi Day. Her great grandfather was born on Pi Day. Or grandfather, maybe grandfather, not great grandfather. But she had never met him. He died really young. But her grandmother always baked a pie on Pi Day in honor of her papa. And she said, like, it just has kept all the kids really engaged with his legacy. So this is years later. He died when she was, I think maybe even before she was born. But this little ritual of having Pi Day on Pi Day, that was his birthday. She said it's like Pa Day for them because it's the day they celebrate their Pa. And I love that idea of continuing that legacy. And it's something she's passed on to her kids, of having this ritual to mark his life every single year, like 50 years after he's died. I thought that was so beautiful. Yes, and creating rituals in digital spaces. I think yes, we do. There's a lot. We need a whole workshop around that because there are so many ways and so many things to think about. One of the last things about spiritual practices is I think a lot about salutogenic design. I am friends with this woman who's a brain scientist, and she's just amazing. And she always makes me think about things. So one of her big principles is salutogenic design. She does a lot in positive psychology, and that we have to think about things through what's working and not what's wrong. So I say that, I put that in the spiritual practices chat, because I think so often we want to become spiritual people in ways that don't feel nourishing or intuitive to us. And so we struggle. So in our spiritual practice, but I think in so many aspects of our life. So I like to think about salutogenic design. What makes you feel good? What is working? When do you feel most spiritual? So if hiking is a spiritual practice that actually makes you feel connected, let's do it. Like let that be your spiritual practice, or walking through the neighborhood. If I have a friend who's like, she said, I would go crazy if I spent 30 minutes in silence and centering prayer. So she doesn't do that. She calls a friend every morning and they pray together to start their day, because she needs a person to talk to in her spiritual practice. Like those kinds of things, like what feels intuitive to you, what works for you, what leaning into what's working versus leaning into what's wrong. I think we so often try to fix what's wrong versus what is working. And so with most of my grief care clients, we have a whole session about what's working. When do you feel okay? Who are the people who are supportive? What are the activities that really help you maintain some normalcy? like those kinds of things. Um, so another thing that I like to talk about is holy curiosity in our grief. Um, thinking about moving from judgment to curiosity. Has anybody seen Ted Lasso? I'm obsessed. It's my favorite show. It's a show on Apple Plus. I am thinking about watching it again because it's warm bath TV. Like it is like comfort food TV. Yes, yes, I binge watched it too. I kept wanting to save it, couldn't do it. Like I had to watch all of it. So he has this. So Ted Lasso, just to give um, a quick synopsis. I'm sure my husband and my teenager are on the other side of the door being like, not her talking about Ted Lasso again. But it's about an American football coach who goes to England to coach soccer. But it's just an amazing, wonderful show. Yes, third watch. Yeah, I'm about to start watching it again because it's just amazing. But he has this part where he talks about people leaning into judgment versus curiosity. And how like his life has opened up when he got curious instead of judgmental. And I've heard, the way he says it is so wonderful. I'm gonna have to find a way to see it because I've seen just that clip. So I'm gonna have to find it during the breakout groups and maybe play it. But so I just want us to lean into being curious about ourselves, not judgmental, about what we're feeling, about how we're dealing with our grief. Just noticing, naming, and honoring. So shifting, like how noticing the feelings that come up and noticing what things feel hard, noticing what things feel easy, just getting curious about it versus saying, I should be in this place. I need to do this thing. Like just noticing it and then naming it, seeing if you can attach a name to it. I keep the feeling wheel. I'm such a little CPE nerd sometimes, but I keep the feeling wheel on my phone because sometimes I just need a list of emotions to like help me name what I'm feeling. And I have a friend, I have too many therapist friends, but I have a therapist friend who won't let me say, I'm doing good. She's like, I need a feeling word. Like, give me a feeling word. And so it helps me just to be like, how am I really feeling beyond good? And then honoring. I think one of the important things we can do in our grief journey is instead of reframing, I hate that I'm feeling sad, because that can actually compound our feelings of sadness. But just a simple reframing, and I got this from Miriam Greenspan's Healing Through Dark Emotions. I am grateful that I have the courage to feel sad right now. I am, really affirming that you are letting yourself feel how you feel. And sometimes just that quick shift of being like, I'm allowing myself to feel sad. And that takes courage. I'm not distracting myself from a really hard feeling right now, and just noticing what you're doing. And so just noticing, naming, and honoring. Another thing outside of our feelings is I did a grief recovery specialist training, and they have something called STIRBs. And they call it short-term energy release behaviors, STIRBs. I just think that's the funniest name. But it's like the things we do to distract ourselves. So like eating, drinking, Netflix, Clearly Me, Ted Lasso all day last week. I mean, all day on Saturday. Social media, whatever it is. But part of it is not judging it, but just getting curious about the behavior. When do I see myself falling into this behavior? When do I see, when do I need, why am I up at 3 a.m. scrolling on Facebook? Clearly that's me. But noticing it, naming and honoring it versus saying, oh my goodness, this is so terrible. Why are you engaging in this behavior? But when I notice it, I can be like, okay, I don't need that right now. Or today's been a hard day. This is the way I'm de-stressing. I'm choosing to do this right now. David, so glad that you were here. And Beverly, I'm glad. Yes, STIRBs, it's so good. And so I just encourage you to get curious about the disturbs that you use and not necessarily judge them, not say, I gotta stop doing whatever it is, but just getting very curious about it. Okay, and along those lines, I'm gonna stop share for a second, but I want us to, and if you were at the PW retreat, we did this too. Um, let me know what comes up. What are the feelings that come up when you're running late? You can put them in the chat. You can you can unmute yourself and say out loud. I just want to hear what feelings come up when you are running late. And let's say running late to church. We are all, I don't know how I run late to online church, but I do. So I'm gonna stop sharing and let us get into anxious, fear. Yes. So many, panic, self-critical, extreme pressure. Yes. I'll put something to, am I frustrated by my ability to be on time? Yes, exactly. That's me. Shame. I feel that a lot too. Embarrassment. Always. Like, why am I late? Literally in the pandemic, I'm like, why am I late and I'm home? Like, what am I doing? Impatient. Yes. I love all of these. Cranky, that's a big one for me. And then I get distracted. It's a lot. Frustrated, all of those. So I just wanted to bring those up to say, if we feel that when we're running late, when in actuality, the consequences are not going to be that dire for the most part. Most of the time when we're late, it's okay. We just say, oh, I'm sorry, I'm late, and we move on. But we still feel all of these things. And so just, Patricia, so glad to have you here. And so just recognizing that when we are grieving, it's all of that times 10, times 100, feeling all these feelings that may feel conflicting, that are compounded. And so sometimes there's just so much wisdom to tangling them out. One of the things that a lot of my hospice clients come to me who are dealing with grief after the death of a loved one, they are so ashamed of themselves for feeling relief. Like they've had so much, they've been a caregiver for a long time, and they've been seeing their loved ones suffer. And so when they die, in addition to feeling all of the pain and the rage and the despair and the fear, they feel relief. And they're like, I'm a terrible person. And so just being able to talk through that, like, no, that's not terrible at all. Like, that is so normal and expected, and like, it's not bad. But sometimes just naming it versus like letting it sit in your chest or wherever you're feeling sit for you, can just be really powerful. And that's why it's so important to have a support system where you can say, I'm feeling this, or even I've had people be like, I'm feeling hopeful about what this next chapter of my life is going to look like, but I feel terrible that I even am at the place where I can feel hope and joy when I've had when I've had such a difficult time. So that I just wanted to name that that we have so many feelings. So I'll go back to share my screen. Let's see if I can get it together. Okay. Of course, I have so many things of versus what I need to. Now, where did I put that? Now y'all looking at my email. Let me stop share while I get it together over here. Bless y'all. So when I did that, I guess forgive me.
Don't feel anxious or judgment.
Yes, I know. Now I'm feeling some real anxiety. Like, how do I not have? Okay.
Okay.
Ready. All right, and then go back to sharing. great Canvas experience right now. I just want to present. Okay, we're getting back to where we are. Okay, so yeah, we talked about that. I really love a strength-based approach to grief care, like really leaning into what your strengths are. I put this website just because I really love it. They have a free character survey where it identifies your character strengths. And part of the research just around this says that even when we are unable to lean into our abilities, our competencies, our talents when we're grieving, we can lean always into our character strengths. And so sometimes there's just real power in knowing what those strengths are. I know I found it really helpful for me to know what they are, and they made sense to me. So immediately, like one of them is love of learning for me. And so that I know that even when I'm feeling at my worst, the idea of like learning a new thing or doing a deep dive into something is attractive to me. Another one is spirituality. So I know like when I'm struggling, I need to have my spiritual practices that anchor me. So whatever it is for you, if you find those, or if you just know them innately, just finding your strengths and leaning into them can really help us in our journey. And so that's one of the activities that I do with some of my clients is have them identify what their character strengths are. I also have found some like Enneagram work helpful. And I know we had an Enneagram session last month, which was so helpful, but even just being able to, and I know there's so much disparate research around like personality traits are not a thing and all these things. But I think for some people, it's just really helpful to label and be able to name tendencies that they see in themselves. And so sometimes people can just derive immense strength from that, knowing that, okay, when I'm a seven and I go in stress, I go here. I just did a workshop with Suzanne Stabile, I love her, about grief and the Enneagram, where she walks through like all of our tendencies based on our Enneagram number in grief. Like, where do we go in grief? And it was just really helpful to know those kinds of things. And so I think it's really, really wonderful to just spend a little bit of time finding your strength. And and just getting to know you. I love that. I love it. So that really helps me. Really, really, that helps me. So if you want to, and it's a free, there are like ones you can pay for a more in-depth character report, but the basic one is free. So you can just have a free character strength. And I have made everybody in my family take it. They're tired of me. All my friends, I'm like, send me your report. I want to know what your character strengths are. So it can be fun if it's nothing else. So I want to talk about modeling good grief. How do we model good grief? So I want everyone to take a minute and identify a good grief role model in your life. You might have not ever thought about this, but where have you seen someone grieving well? I'm going to stop share for a second. And I'd love for you to pop in if anything comes to mind of seeing someone grieving well. I will start with just a story a friend told me the other day. She was at work and a colleague sent her a message saying, I just went through a bad breakup and I am just distracted this morning. So do you mind if we schedule our meeting for later in the week? And my friend was like, oh, she's doing too much. Like, I don't need to know all that. But for me, I was like, that's really what a gift it is to just be upfront. Like, I'm struggling. And saying it. So I just really loved that honesty and vulnerability around grief. It was really, really helpful for me to see that people can just name what's going on, share it, and be like, feel how you feel about it. Okay, Kate, I like it. A former coworker whose husband had Lewy body dementia. Yes. My two friends who lost their husbands from ALS and walked with me. My teenage granddaughter with the loss of her father. Wow. Yeah. Nashawn, my nephew, he is definitely my good grief role model. Um, yes, bringing up the deceased name in regular conversation, often through tears, but sharing beloved stories very regularly. That is such a good grief practice. And I just think there's so much power in um, identifying good grief role models. Um, I'm reading this book called Pleasure Activism, and I love it. It's by Adrienne Marie Brown. But one of the activities she has in the book is to develop your pleasure lineage. Like, who taught you how to experience pleasure? Who taught you what pleasure meant? And so, because I do so much in grief work, it automatically, I was like, we got to do that around grief. What is our grief lineage? What, for good or bad, what messages have we gotten around grief? And who are the role models that we can lift up to say, I saw them grieving really well, or I saw them modeling grief. And I think often when we think, just even saying somebody grieving well can sound like, what does that mean? Like, but I think it doesn't mean that they weren't sad. It doesn't mean that they aren't struggling, but it just means that they grieved well. They grieved in real time. They were honest about how they were feeling. They had the support structures that they needed. They grieved in a way that felt really meaningful and authentic to them. They grieved in public. Yeah, like there's so much around that we can see in grief. And I think that brings up a good point about, once again, we're in this pandemic time where we're not grief. A definition of mourning I like is grief gone public. And so, like, how do we mourn? So, grief, some researchers delineate it like grief is our internal process around loss, the normal and natural reaction that we have to loss. Mourning is that grief expressed in public. So I think that is such an important conversation. How do we mourn? Just this weekend, I mean, just in the Susan Stabile workshop, she shared that when her husband dies, he's still alive. But she says first she wanted him to die before she wants him to die. She wants to die before he does, because she said, I'm going to be a mess. But she said in there, she's United Methodist, but she said, we go to a little white church. And she said, I've already decided we are having his funeral at a Black church because I don't want to act right. Like I don't want to sit with a hanky. She was like, I want to grieve in public. And she was talking about how like her good grief role models are people who mourned and wailed and cried, and how like in her family, that's just not the way people act in funerals. So she said, we've already got this together. Like I want to wail. I want to fall on the floor. And as a hospice chaplain, it's been interesting because I'm at the bedside when a lot of people die. And it's interesting to see how people mourn. And the more interesting thing is how people react to that mourning. So I have nurses who will call me in the middle of the night without fail and say, these people are just out of control. And so I get there and they're just mourning. And I'm like, that's okay. People can cry and wail and roll on the floor and break things. Like their loved one just died. So just being comfortable with mourning is one thing that I'm like, we can do as a culture, and these are hospice nurses who are wonderful, loving, caring people who do good work as hospice professionals, but they struggle with the mourning. And so they're always wanting me to interrupt it. They're like, give them tissues, go ask them if they want something to eat, do whatever you can to like stop them from crying. But I just think there's so much power in mourning outwardly, grieving publicly. Oh, I love that. I love that, Reverend Aisha. having two services. I think that is real, full on morning and the memorial service. I think we need both. I love that. So I do, once again, it's got me thinking about in the pandemic, we haven't been able to have these services in the same way. And so how that will complicate grieving as we go forward, it's making me really, really think about that. I'm going to get myself together on this end this time. When I share my screen again. Okay. So I'm going to share again. Let me see. My computer is doing something really weird this morning.
You're doing great. You're doing great. You should.
I do want to, there's one thing I did not show you. So I want to show you, and I just forgot. And so going back is making me want to go back to this. So let me share again. Right. Okay, got it. All right, I'm doing the right thing. And I'm going to present again. There's got to be an easier way, but I will have to find that. But I'm going to go back a little bit because I forgot to point this out in one of the photos. Oh, I don't know, I didn't put it up there. So let me actually just pull it up because I was reminded of it yesterday. So can y'all see that? There is, oh. Okay, what did I just do? All right, let me put it up again. Bring it to the front. It's giving me this weird message. Okay, can you just see the in loving memory of Marcel de la Rue?
No, we're seeing your slideshow.
Ah, okay. It's telling me.
If you have a picture, there is a way to share, and then it'll give you all the boxes. And there is a way to show if you have a picture up, you can highlight the picture itself.
Okay, awesome. I'll do that. Okay, here we are. So this is at Oakhurst Press. And I just remember looking up one day and seeing this in loving memory of Marcel de la Rue. And 1956 to, no, y'all, I can't do math, not 13. Why am I struggling with math right now? But anyway, the loss of a child. And it just really struck me to see this on the wall, never having noticed. And I think I noticed it so much because of working at the time. I was working as a pediatric hospice chaplain, and it just struck me that there is grief all around us. And to see it, and it just made me wonder, how was this family supported at Oakhurst at that time, in the 50s and the 60s. And I don't know, it's just something that has stuck with me. And that very same day, we had paid, in our hymnals to have, in honor of, I saw my grandparents. I had never seen that particular hymnal. I have a picture of that too. Let me see if I can find that. But I have a picture of that hymnal, and I found that. But just thinking about yes, 7. Thank you, Gregory. I don't know where I got 13 from. I don't know. But it was just, that. So now every time I go into the church, I see that. And seeing all these reminders of grief and loss. And it just made me wonder, how do we share those things. How was that person supported? So as we go into the next kind of last phase of our talk, I wanted to I wanted to just share that, because I think we have all these reminders of grief. And one of the things that I saw yesterday as I was preparing and thinking about this workshop is People magazine. I was at my parents' house, and they had the new People, and it has Kobe Bryant's widow in there. And so she talks about her grief journey of losing her child and her spouse. And then there's also, in that same magazine, there's an interview with George Floyd's family, and what it's like processing his loss almost a year later. And so it's just seeing these two profiles of families who are in the throes of grief. And it just made me wonder about how they are being and feeling supported. But that one of the things that Vanessa Bryant talks a lot about is her support system, and how that has helped her so much. So I just really appreciated that. So I'm going to go back, share my screen again, and we are almost at the time where we can just talk. I will fly through some of this other stuff. Okay, let's see where we are. Modeling good grief. All right. These are two things that just how we talk about grief. I just included this email because this sparked quite the conversation on my Facebook page. And it's an email. It's not having to do with grief, but it made me wonder about our email messages, our away messages, how we communicate what's going on with us. So I'll read it if you're having any trouble seeing it. It says, "Aloha, due to patriarchy, I am behind in emails. I hope to respond to your message soon. But like many women, I am working full-time while tending to an infant and toddler full-time. According to the Washington Post, the average length of an uninterrupted stretch of work time for parents during COVID-19 was 3 minutes and 24 seconds. If you have a time-sensitive need, please call me between 7:45 and 4:30. Very best, Kahara Jabula Karulis." And I just wondered, what would it be like to have that kind of away message about our grief? And I did a little Google search to see what people typically put, and so many HR professionals gave the advice of don't share. Don't share much at all. Like keep it very, very, keep it very vague. And I wonder if under the guise of professionalism and like not making people uncomfortable, what are we doing? Anyway, that was a question that I just, it just came to my mind. Like, can we have, like, is that modeling good grief to say, hey, I'm in the throes of grief. I'm distracted right now. I will try to get back to you, but I'm just thinking of ways that we can model grief. I have no recommendations, but it's just something that popped into my head when I saw that viral email of if we could just really get a lot more comfortable being really open about what we're going through, and if that would give other people permission to grieve. And I just saw this button online, be kind, be gentle, I'm grieving. Alan Woolfelt, who's another grief researcher, he does a lot of, he sells on his website like buttons that say, I'm grieving, because he talks about how like we don't have those markers in our society of mourning. So everybody's not wearing black. Everybody's not wearing the same thing. There's no markers that tell people that they're grieving. So he says that people should be more open to say, look, I am grieving. And I just love that idea. That's what I really, really, really love. And what did I say about that? Yes, Erin, I was wondering that too about church staff. I do feel like people are given more space. I actually, on my Facebook page, I had someone say, I'm an HR professional. And, like people don't need to say what they, like that's too much. The email she sent, I would never allow somebody in my organization to send that. Or I don't think people need to say that they're grieving, but I do think like we've got to shift some things in our society. We've got to. Yeah. I believe that. And so I even think just being able to say, be kind, be gentle, I'm grieving. And one of the things I just heard a gentleman say in a grief workshop is that he abides by the 100-0 rule. It's 100% his responsibility to communicate that he's grieving. It's 0% his responsibility how other people respond. So he said, I just had to take that off. Like if somebody says something insensitive, if someone doesn't respond the way I think they should respond, I just need to be okay with that. But it's 100% up to me to communicate that I am going to cry. He had just lost his granddaughter. This is difficult for me. I am going to, he was like, he's like, that's how I lead in conversations. He's a pastor as well. And he said, like, I want you to bring up my granddaughter, but know that I'm probably going to cry when that happens. And so he said, I just had to tell all my parishioners that and have them be comfortable with that or not be comfortable, but it's not my responsibility. So I really appreciated him saying that he said, I lead with grief right now because that is primarily what I'm experiencing. And so I really appreciated him modeling that good grief. Like, this is what's happening to me. He said, like, one of the things he shared is, I want to hear about your grandchildren because I love hearing about them, but hearing about your grandchildren is going to make me cry. So you just have to be comfortable with me crying. And so I'm going to quickly, and then we're going to have a little bit of time in some breakout groups, but just supporting others on their grief journey. There's a website I follow called What's Your Grief? And they have this series called 64 Things. And so you can go on their blog and they have like all 64 things, but they'll post just a few. But these are 64 things of the best things ever said to a griever. And that is what people will submit to them. So these are just not what they've determined. It's what they ask people to submit things. And these are the things that they submitted. There are no words. Tell me more about your loved one. Grief has no expiration date. You don't have to talk. I will just sit beside you. We won't forget him. I don't know what to say, but I can listen. She would be proud of you. I love you. We will get through this together. I'm sorry. I think so often we talk about what not to say, which is important because people say some ridiculous things. But I think that's a good exercise. So I would love to know in the chat if there are things that someone said to you when you were grieving that were really helpful. Like, what are those things that just, you were like, thank you for saying that. I think it's powerful to have that, to know those things that we say. And then kind of what we do. These are, and if I can send a follow-up email, I can send this to you, but these are just, I found this when I was supporting pediatric hospice, and it was compiled by a group of grieving moms, and it was 30 simple ways to show you care. And they were saying, walk their dogs, take their other kids out to eat after school. Like there's 30 of them. I'll send a link to this. Give dining cards so they won't have to face the empty chair. Give an engraved rock with their child's name for the garden. Offer to meet them for a walk, go wash their car. One of the things that I hear from so many of the grieving families I support is people say, just tell me what you need. And I know most of us have heard this, but you don't know what you need when you're grieving. So sometimes offering something specific can be really, really, really helpful. So I really appreciate that. Just these things. Leave a bag of groceries at their door. All kind of stuff. I like this one. Leave Unisom or Z-Quill at their door. They can't sleep. Donate to a charity in their child's honor. Leave a note on their door. And 30, I think, is really important. Expect nothing in return. Remember, they're gone. really, really gone. So these are just 30 ways. And when my chat is, I can't see my chat right now, but I'm about to wrap up, but I wanted to, because we're going to go into breakout groups for a little bit, but I wanted to also offer this. How can we practice thinking beyond traditional conceptions of grief, family, bereavement, and sympathy? So one of the things that really I struggle with is this kind of idea of hierarchy of loss. And I think we do that a lot in our workplaces, in our conversations. Like, the top tier of losing someone is this, like if I lose my child, like that's the top tier, or if I lose my husband, and a parent is after that, like we do that. And those are all hard losses. And please don't hear me saying that these aren't hard losses, but I think we have to get beyond these traditional conceptions of labels of family, because every loss is so different and individual for each person. And I say that because just yesterday, I was meeting with a young man who told me, like, he had called me and said, I really need to talk to somebody. I'm really struggling with processing this loss. He had lost both of his grandparents in COVID to COVID 10 days apart. And then when we got on the phone, he kept saying, it's not just my grandparents, they raised me. Like when I was 6, my mom had lots of issues. And so they're my parents. But it's like he wanted me to know, like, they're really important to me. They're not just they're not just my grandparents, if that makes any sense. And so, but I hear that all the time. Like, people will say, I lost my cousin, but she's like a sister to me. Versus like, the way we do family is so different. I think about that in my own life. I'm my nephew's aunt, like in the family structure, but like I'm also a parent. So like, I don't ever want him to have to explain all of that story to explain why he's grieving me. And so it's one of the things that I just think so much about, is like, we've got to move beyond these traditional conceptions of grief and family and bereavement and sympathy, and who we actually allow people to be in bereavement for. So that's something that comes up so often for me. And like, like these conceptions of family are often very, and why I put traditional in quotes, because they're traditional. They're like very Western. It's a very patriarchal and capitalistic way of labeling our connections. People don't get time off from work when their friend dies, even if it, like my friend, is a person I talk to every single day. Like, they feel weird asking for time off. I also want to just say this too. When George Floyd died, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, I don't know any Black people who weren't grieving. And I say that not to be hyperbolic, but like, my text chains were full of like, this is really hard. And I don't know, but I can't explain to people who don't understand what this grief is like. So I know people are like, how can you grieve someone you don't know? We do. And so that's kind of like, as I wrap up, I just offer just moving beyond and just practicing thinking about grief and family and bereavement and sympathy in completely different ways, beyond traditional models of efficiency and productivity and like, who gets time off and like 3 days off. Just that has just kind of, that's something that's really been in my heart a lot. Like, the way that people feel like they have to explain who they care about and like who they're grieving. There's so much disenfranchised loss, and disenfranchised losses, those losses that we can't grieve normally, those relationships that people don't understand. And so those losses get disenfranchised. And so just thinking about in our own life and our own thinking, moving beyond grief. People can grieve a breakup that's not a marriage, and I feel like people feel some type of way, like, I just broke up with somebody, or they don't feel that way, but they feel like other people are perceiving like that loss that way. So And I'm going to stop sharing because I want to read the chat, and then we're going to have our breakout groups. So yes. I'm just looking at all of these. I'm going to make sure I save this chat. This is wonderful. So. Thank Laura. That's such a good question. How do you grieve when it's not? Are you asking when it's not family? I think that can be such a hard grief to explain to people. But I think we just move through the grief process in the same way that we would if it was grief. Another question I got that was really interesting. How do we grieve something that hasn't happened? A woman was asking me that recently. She's like, she was telling me she was 46. She'd always wanted to get married, always wanted children. That hadn't happened for her. So she said, I'm grieving that, but you can't grieve. People don't want to hear you grieving something that did not happen. But that is a grief. And so I just, grief over broken relationships. Yes. Curious about pre-grief. Yes, those are such real. We could talk about all of these things. I think pre-grief, the technical term that a lot of therapists use is anticipatory grief. But I always say anticipatory grief is not anticipatory grief. It's grief. It's grief. Because all the things that happen in the grief process are happening in that time as you're watching someone decline physically, mentally, however. Oh, Erin, I love that book too. That's such a good resource. There's no good card for this. Janelle, thank you for lifting up the grief of the broken relationships. That is one that's come up a lot in a lot of my circles. People really struggling after these political discussions. A friend of mine has broken a friendship with someone that's been her friend since for 30 plus years. But this election has severed their friendship. And so that is one thing that I think we don't talk a lot about, the grief of broken friendships. So I have been talking for a whole long time. So I really want to have us talk in breakout groups. Gregory, thanks for that. That's one of the things that I meant to mention and did not, is churches coming up with grief protocols, so to speak, for their churches. I was just talking with the pastors at North Avenue, and they send out the Journeying Through Grief series to anyone in their congregation that's experienced a loss. And I ordered it just because I was curious, and I love it. It's such a great resource. And so sending those out to families. I will quickly say a couple of things I think that are helpful, especially for ministers supporting people who are grieving, is keeping a calendar. I actually just asked at Oakhurst, is there a place in One Church, because we now use the One Church software, to put like tender days, or what I call them, like is the day that, a death anniversary or a birthday of someone who died, or an anniversary for someone's spouse who's no longer living, and making sure, being very, very intentional about marking those days with cards or notes, or even a text or a call from clergy or deacons, just to say, I'm thinking about you. I know this might be a hard day. I'm always surprised. I do that as a hospice chaplain, and it's really software driven. It's not my memory, but I will do it. And I have a spreadsheet of okay, this is the anniversary of Miss X's husband's death, or the 6-month anniversary, or whatever it is. And I'll call. And at first I was like, do people really want to be reminded of this on this day? But almost every time someone's like, thank you for remembering. Thank you for calling. And it always makes, I'm like, I didn't remember, but I did call. But it's always such a I was sitting here thinking about it. No one else has acknowledged it. It just means a lot that you thought about it. So I think those types of things are really, really helpful. I think that tracking is so important. And just That's one thing, just having that. And then also just thinking beyond casseroles, but thinking how churches can really support. Like one of the things that I am putting together is a program to help people sort and release belongings after the death of a loved one, because that can be such a difficult process. And just having a companion while you're doing it can be such a help. So helping with that. So if you have someone in your congregation who's really good with that, and somebody is struggling, that's something that they can do. Not everybody is good at sitting and with silence. I mean, it just isn't, or not. There are people who really feel like they need to do things. And so helping them do things. I have a colleague from a Scotty who just started a business called Black Dress Consultants. And she helps people tend to the logistics after a death. She had to deal with the death of both of her parents and an uncle very quickly, an uncle that she was the executor for his estate. And she just talked about how that is no one knows all the things that go into the logistics after a death until you are experiencing it. So if you have someone in your congregation who can be helpful for that, that is really powerful. And one little last thing before we hop into breakout groups is also one of the things that I think churches can do is have a referral list for people. And I know it gets tricky because sometimes you don't want to be like endorsing something you don't completely know, but I know people struggle with like a funeral home. Like they're like, if it's an unexpected death, they have no idea what funeral home to call sometimes, or if they're new to the area or whatever. So sometimes even being able to say, these are funeral homes that other church members have used that were really helpful, that I felt were fair, can be helpful. Or like hospice companies when people are trying to figure out but just some probate or estate attorneys, just some place for people to start. Because I had one of my clients who I just helped go through her house. She was like, I haven't done any of the stuff for my husband's life insurance because I don't know where to begin. Because she needs his like death certificate and his birth certificate for this particular policy. And she's like, the thought of like in the state I'm in, trying to do that. So we were able to like connect her with someone who could help her do that. So like those kinds of things, just checking in with people after they're dealing with these logistics of death. I think our faith communities have so many resources for that. And so many of us have been through those things, and just having a list. I just give people a checklist. I have it right here actually on my desk. What to do when a loved one dies. Like it just goes through all of the like logistics so that people can see what to do, because people are like, I have no idea. So even a list like that is really, really super helpful. Yes. So in our last, I feel like I did so much talking, but in our last, yes, I'll share that. I'll put together a bibliography and send it to Chip and Reverend Aisha and see if I can send that all out. But I would love in our last minutes of talking to each other is to talk about a small grief of the pandemic or of your life generally that you just haven't had the opportunity to grieve, that you just want to name, something that it feels, something that feels silly to name. I think that like getting in the habit of saying a small grief, I do this in one of my groups, and it's always such a powerful thing of naming these little things that we're like, I can't grieve that, but we are. So just before we go into the breakout groups, I just want to share my small grief as you think about yours, because it's so silly. It is very vulnerable, but it is a grief. In October, a tree fell on our house. And it did a lot of damage. It completely, like the ceiling of our bedroom collapsed. So we have just moved back into our house on Sunday. So we have been in an Airbnb since then. But the little grief, one, I talk about grief all the time, but I didn't want to name the grief of my house because I knew it was going to get fixed. but I still kept being like, it's okay. You know, I don't, it's, you know, it's going to get fixed. But I was grieving. Like, I wasn't living in my house in a pandemic where all we can do is be in our house. I wasn't in my house and I was struggling. And when I finally just named it, it was helpful. But my small grief right now, after moving back into my house, is my bed. Um, when the ceiling collapsed, the insurance company, I didn't even know people did this, they totaled the bed. And it was my first like adult purchase with my spouse. And it's like, it's gonna be replaced, but not having the bed that we bought, that I was so excited, that's been a small grief, you know, that I just am like, I love that bed. It had gotten broken into the point where it was perfect for us. And so that's just a small grief that I share. So we're going to get into breakout groups, and I'd love for you to just share a small grief with one another, if you're able to, and then any processing that you want to do about the presentation, and then we'll come back. I had planned to give you 20 minutes, but we don't have a whole lot of time. So let's say 15 minutes, Chip, and then we'll come back for 5 minutes just to wrap up. So.
All right.
All right.
I will send people out now.
Thank you, Chip. Welcome back, everybody. I just wanted to bring everybody back and to see if there's anything you'd want to share to the larger group, or before we wrap up. I know we are right at our time, but this has just been such a pleasure, and I'm just so grateful for all of you. So the floor is open if anybody'd like to share anything.
I think a comment that came from our small group was that we really need to be equipped to listen right now, through COVID and through many, many losses that people have had, that they're grieving.
We spent a lot of time talking in our little, in our breakout room here, the larger room, about equipping people with the skills to listen, you know, and to like be able to companion people in grief, because it really is a skill. The same way we learn to grieve, we also have to learn how to support people in their grief. And that's not something we all can do. Yeah. Without some training and some tips and techniques.
When I graduated nursing school, my father, who was a Presbyterian minister, gave me the book from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross on death and dying. And I said, Dad, I don't want this. I'm not going to take care of old people. And he said, honey, you just have no idea what life's going to have for you. And I was so grateful later that I actually read that and began nursing with that in my mind.
Yes. Yeah, I'm so grateful for our time together. And I will send out a bibliography of things that I've mentioned, and also my contact information. Please, reach out to me if you have any questions, if you'd like to put together a workshop for your congregation specific for a need. Please reach out to me. So I'll have all my information in that. I would love to just keep connected with you. This has been such a gift. So thank you.
Zeena, I was sharing with the group the different tradition. The Eastern Orthodox tradition, where I grew in the Galilee area, they have a service of the resurrection. And then for the family, after 9 days, another service on 30 days, another service 6 months, another service a year later, only reading the psalm and the scripture. That ancient church realized that we are not wood and we are not steel, we are flesh and blood, and they need the scripture to speak to our psyche. In our American culture, we die, goodbye, and go jump in the lake. I mean, there's not, I think that Eastern tradition or that ancient church realized we need more help.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing that. That's so powerful.
On that line, I would like to say that I am a Latina, and in Latina we have one single year in the year, one day in the year that we call the day of the death, and it's November 2nd. And that day, actually, we have this whole idea that we are with our loved ones who have gone and passed before, and we have everything that they actually like it, the food, the drinks, anything they love, we have that day in the altar so they can return it. So they will never be forgotten, but we will keep them alive. They are with us.
Beautiful. I could talk about this forever because I just got this book called Past and Present. And it's all about the way we memorialize our loved ones after their death and like how we just keep that going. And it was such a gift. I just ordered it. So I'll put that on the bibliography too. That's good.
Zeena, can you add the movie Coco? If you haven't seen that movie, it is amazing and just a great conversation piece. We watched it with my son not long after his father had passed, and I was like, "You sure you can watch this?" But it's just a great way of celebrating those who've gone before us. It's a wonderful movie.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. I'll turn it back over to Aisha, but I'm so grateful, and look for the message from me, and I'll have all my information on there and all of these resources we talked about. So
Yes, Aaron, the movie is Coco. If you Google it, it'll come right up. It's perfect. I am going to close this with a prayer, friends. Like Zeena said, follow up with her. But if you like another one of these around grief, resilience, there's so much richness in this. Please let us know how we can continue to support as a presbytery and have these conversations together. So I will close us in prayer. God of grace and God of glory, we give you thanks that you gathered us together. We thank you for our sister Zeena and for her gifts, for her sensitivity around grief. And we thank you for your spirit. We thank you for the gift of the church and allowing us to walk along those who go through difficult things. Help us to continue to be the church that is aware and listening and sensitive and encouraging, and help us to be in tune with our own grief so that we can care for others beyond Casseroles. So thank you for this time, and be with us as we go our separate ways. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of the week. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.